Okay, so welcome everybody. We have a really large number of people signed up. It's very exciting. About 75 people have signed up to listen to Walter Gable. Thank you to everybody. Thank you for your interest in local history. It's really great. And I do plan to record this, and so it should be available on our website for anyone who wants to see it or refer other people to watch it. And I would appreciate any feedback if you have any ideas for us to continue with other programs that you might like to listen in on or sit in on. That would be great. Feel free to give me any feedback. My name's Monica Wilkinson Kelly. I'm the archivist here at the Edith B. Ford Memorial Library. And tonight the library is so honored to host this program featuring our Seneca County historian, Walter Gable. He needs no introduction. I think many of you know him by now. He grew up in Romulus, went to Romulus High School, and has a degree and a master's in history from Syracuse University. So tonight, if you have any questions, if you could just please put them in our chat box. And if we have time, Harrison Eck, our library assistant, will be really monitoring the chat box, and we will try to get to your questions at the end, time permitting. And then if anyone is not familiar with Zoom, if you could please mute your microphone when we start the talk. So with no further delay, please welcome Walter Gable, Seneca County historian.
Thank you, Monica. Welcome, everyone. I am pleased to have this opportunity to share with you the history of the Seneca Army Depot. I could talk for hours, and I'm going to try to keep it to just a little bit over 40 minutes. Much of what I am sharing in this presentation comes from the information discussed in greater detail in the book, The Seneca Army Depot, Fighting Wars from the New York Home Front. I was the primary author of that book that was published by the History Group Press, in 2012. For those viewers of this program that are from outside of New York State, and there may be some, this map shows the location of Seneca County in central western New York State, and then the location within Seneca County of the former Seneca Army Depot. This map gives another view of where the former Seneca Army Depot is located relative to other places within Seneca County. This map was prepared by Michael Karpovich. To his map, I have highlighted with those red arrows the location of the many munitions bunkers, see all of the rows of them, the Q area at the extreme top right, and the many office buildings and nearby warehouses just off from Route 96. Seneca Lake is basically the western boundary of the new military tract, as it became known. The new military tract was the area of lands that were given to New York veterans of military service in the Revolutionary War. The map at left shows different colors for the different towns that were surveyed and created to be able to give these lands. The map at right shows a close-up of the Romulus Township. You will note that within each township there were different numbers too. The Seneca Army Depot will be located on portions of lots numbered in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. The Romulus Township underwent boundary changes. In 1800, the northern portion of Romulus Township became the town of Washington, which in 1808 was renamed Fayette. In 1830, the remaining northern portion of the town of Romulus became the town of Varick, As a result, the Seneca Army Depot will consist of portions of the towns of both Varick and Romulus. Clearly, the primary economic livelihood of this area, taken by the federal government in 1941 to create the Seneca Ordnance Depot, primarily it was agricultural. There were many farmers producing cash crops, milk and dairy products, and there were vineyards and orchards. There was also a very active church, the First Baptist Church of Romulus, or as it was more commonly known, the Kendall Baptist Church, and its cemetery. Now, why was this Seneca County site chosen? The Franklin D. Roosevelt administration was actively preparing the United States militarily for full involvement in World War II, with a defense buildup that took on many forms. Part of this administration's plan was to establish 4 munitions or weapons supply bases, 2 each on the Pacific Ocean coastal area and 2 on the Atlantic Ocean coastal area, to defend against aerial attacks on the United States. For the North Atlantic Coastal Munitions Supply Base, over 60 sites were considered, but the Mid-Seneca County site was chosen for some very obvious reasons. In this frame, I show 3 of those reasons. First, there was already in operation rail lines on both the east and west sides of the site chosen. You need to remember that in 1941, most heavy transport took place by railroad. Second, this area was in a remote, low populated area. This would mean that fewer people had to be moved off their property. Third, the Mid-Seneca County site has a layer of shale not far beneath the topsoil. This shale layer would help diminish the impact of any foreign bombing of one or more of the munition bunkers that would be built. As Colonel Parker says here, it might cause some rattling of the windows, but that would be about it. Some other reasons for the choice are listed here. Fourth, land prices in Mid-Seneca County were cheaper than many of the other sites under consideration. Fifth, it was perceived that the Mid-Seneca County residents who would be forced off their properties were true patriots. You will note that the public relations staff for the Department of the Army emphasized, quote, the all-American makeup of the population of this area. Note the patriotic quote attributed to Edith Googe Lisk at the bottom. She was one of the dispossessed property owners. I'll have more to say about this quote in another frame. Another likely factor was politics. My high school history teacher, Miss Ethel Buckley, said that President Roosevelt wanted bipartisan support for his military buildup plans. Our local congressman was John Tabor of Auburn, and he was a Republican. Not only that, but he was the ranking Republican on the House Appropriations Committee. Getting his support would be very helpful in securing FDR's defense buildup legislation to get passed in a bipartisan way. There is some reason to believe that a kind of understanding was reached that if Tabor supported Franklin Roosevelt's military defense plans, then one of the new munition bases could be located in his congressional district. Excuse me. It is a fact that in the spring of 1941, Congressman Tabor changed his position to now be in support of FDR's request for $11 billion in defense spending. It is a fact that in June 1941, our Mid-Seneca County site was chosen for one of 4 new munitions depots to be built. It is a fact that this Mid-Seneca County site was located in Congressman Tabor's district. Here I share some of the information I gathered in an interview with former Seneca County historian Charmian Dinsmore. You see that she says her father, as chairperson of the Seneca County Democratic Party, lobbied heavily for a Seneca County site to be chosen. So was politics involved? There is no definitive proof of these allegations of politics playing a role in the selection of the Seneca County site. But I will leave it up to you, the listener, to decide what really to conclude. Now, to begin to talk about the over 100 farm families that were dispossessed of their property so that the Seneca Ordnance Depot could be built. This dispossession of their farm properties was particularly difficult for many, if not all, of these farm families. I say that because in many instances, the farm properties had been in the families for several generations. Although the federal government paid them for their lands, how do you put a dollar value on the memories and so on of the property for these generations? Another problem for the dispossessed farmers was that this dispossession was happening in harvest season. In many cases, the federal government, in its haste to begin construction, simply didn't take the time for the grain crops to be harvested. This was particularly upsetting to farmers who were well aware that there were in urban America people in food lines. I need to add that if the property owners didn't give up their properties, the federal government could make use of eminent domain rights to seize these properties. This eminent domain procedure, however, was avoided for almost all of the properties. Just days after the War Department's June 10th public announcement, a front page article in the Syracuse Post-Standard lamented the predatory action of the federal government and the irrevocable transformation of the Seneca County people and landscape. Even more troubling to this reporter than the loss of the bountiful land was this destruction of an entire community that had developed over generations. Now, to make some specific comments about the patriotic quote mentioned earlier when I was talking about reasons for selection of this mid-Seneca County site. The public relations staff of the federal government prepared virtually every day a daily press release, which the area newspapers eagerly printed. This is a portion of the article appearing in the Syracuse Post-Standard, July 27th, 1941. Shown in the picture are both John and Edith Gooch Lisk. Because they were in the area where the first construction of the Seneca Ordnance Depot was to take place, they experienced firsthand how these property owners had only 3 days formal notice to vacate their property. The PR staff quoted her as saying, "I'd rather give my farm to the government now to make America strong than to see another woman give her son's life to the defense of the country when we didn't prepare." Sally Van Riper Eller, a granddaughter of Edith Lisk, said that her grandmother would have never actually said such a patriotic comment. Mrs. Eller said that her grandmother was actually very bitter the rest of her life for their being forced off their farm. For all the property owners who were to be dispossessed, this is how it took place. Each individual property was given a parcel number. If you look at the bottom left of the house in the lower left, you will see there is a number 81, meaning that this parcel of property was numbered 81. The house was given the letter A. The main barn on the parcel was given the letter B, and other letters were used for the various buildings on that parcel of property. The federal government brought in appraisers to determine what the government considered would be a fair price for the property and the buildings, and the crop if it wasn't going to be harvested. The property owner was going to be paid that amount, but it took several months before these payments even began to be sent out. At top left, you see a picture of a mother and son loading a small item onto their truck as they prepare to move. Also shown next to that is a man apparently trying to prepare that small building to be moved. The picture at lower right shows little daughters of one property owner on their moving day. I think you can understand how these young girls didn't really comprehend what all this dispossession meant. Note how especially the girl in the middle has a facial expression that is not a happy one. Barton Van Riper owned property in the area of the first construction of this new munitions base. The actions of the War Department were moving very fast. On the left, you see a July 23rd, 1941 letter from one office within the Army War Department, saying that on July 22nd, the federal government accepted taking ownership of Mr. Van Riper's property. The letter at right, dated July 22nd, 1941, from another office within the Army War Department, notified Mr. Van Riper that the federal government was taking possession of the property within 3 days. Imagine if you were given 3 days' notice to move. What would you take with you? What would you leave behind? What if you didn't have any vehicle of your own to use in making this move? Another problem was making the necessary deed transfers on all these parcels in a short period of time. The federal government brought in people to assist the county clerk's office in recording the deed transfers. But the problem of determining clear deed information for some parcels. Fortunately, Charlie Dunlap, shown here, an elderly gentleman of the area, provided his personal recollections of who owns several parcels so that a determination of a clear title could be made. Now just look at this picture of him. Is that a person who you would consider to be of unreliable character? The federal government allowed an owner to buy back any building the owner wanted, provided the person would move the building off the depot property before construction work started on that parcel. Some property owners, especially those who had a few weeks to vacate their property, managed to make arrangements to move their home to another site. Shown in these pictures are some of the homes that were moved. Barton Van Riper, who I have referred to earlier as having only 3 days' notice to vacate, bought back his chicken coop, moved the building to his beach property on Cayuga Lake. He then added on to it and made it into his new family home. This is a map showing the properties and the names of the property owners who were dispossessed of their farms. I have highlighted with red arrows the location of the two railroad lines, one on the east and one on the west side of the Seneca Ordnance Depot area. This is an enlargement of a portion of that map that I just showed. In this map portion, I have indicated with red arrows to the left the parcels owned by John and Edith Gooch Lisk. The two separate orange arrows, one near the top right and one below the Lisk properties wording, show the parcels owned by Barton Van Riper. The blue arrows on the right side, near the bottom half, show properties owned by other Van Riper relatives. Barton Van Riper's wife is the daughter of John and Edith Lisk. With a black arrow to the left, I point out the location of the Wesleyan Methodist Church properties. Near the top of this map, with a green arrow, I have a parcel of property that was owned by the Waterloo Bank. This parcel was probably repossessed by the bank when the property owner failed to make the necessary mortgage payments. Remember, this was still the time of the Great Depression. The large numbers such as 57, 58, 62, 63 are the lot numbers from the original military tract for Romulus. You will note that for each parcel, there is the number of the parcel with the name of the property owner. If you really want a copy of this map, you can contact my office and I can help to make that possible. In 2011, local historians of Seneca County and myself presented a series of public programs tracing the history of the Seneca Army Depot to mark the 70th anniversary of its establishment. We gathered much information, so we decided that it needed to be put into a book, which happened. Also, we determined that there was a definite need to erect two long overdue historic markers. One was to denote the existence of the depot, a marker I'll talk about later in the program. The other historic marker is the one shown here, which pays respect to the many families who were dispossessed of their property to make way for the Seneca Ordnance Depot in 1941, and those dispossessed in 1942 to make way for the Sampson Naval Station. This marker is on the east side of Route 96A, near the entrance to Sampson State Park. It was dedicated on July 12, 2012. Despite its being an extremely hot summer day, many descendants and even at least two still living dispossessed persons were present for that ceremony. The keynote speaker was L. Dean Bruno, who wrote a fascinating master thesis about these dispossessed families. The Kendall Baptist Church was a fully active congregation at the time the federal government took over its property. As shown in this picture, the congregation held its last service in this church building on September 7th, 1941. The congregation then started holding services elsewhere. The church building was used by the Army for storage during construction of the depot. In the mid-1950s, the federal government sold the building and it was moved. It no longer stands, however. At that final church service, Paul Baldridge read this poem in which he paid tribute to the dispossessed families, calling them the Patriots of 41. Starting with this frame, I'm going to focus in a few frames on the Baldridge family, who owned several properties taken for the Seneca Ordnance Depot. At the top, I have listed the parcels of property owned by the various Baldridges. You will note that these parcels probably have to be agricultural areas, farms, orchards, vineyards, and so on, because of the acreage of the parcels. At the bottom, I have shown with the blue oval the main Baldridge properties in the town of Romulus taken for the depot. Here we see some pictures of 3 generations of Baldridge men. In the middle is shown Addison Baldridge. To the left is his son, Charles J., commonly called C.J. Baldridge. At the right is Charles's son, Mark, holding a swarm of bees. The Baldridge brothers were a commercial farming enterprise. They had a grain elevator. They also owned a hardware agricultural supply store in Candia. As you saw in the previous slide, the Baldridges were also major commercial beekeepers. This is an old picture showing one of several fruit orchard businesses in the Candia area. Businesses disrupted by the coming of the depot. There were many Baldridge family members stretching over a few generations. Here you see pictures of a Baldridge family reunion, probably only a few years prior to the coming of the depot. Baldridges had been living in the Candia area since at least the very early 1800s. This is a picture and caption to it that the public relations people for the Department of the Army released at the time of the dispossession of the property owners. Here you see Mr. Baldridge standing in front of a portion of his picket fence. Note that the fence parts are believed to be 112 years old, according to the caption. Imagine how this farm has been in the Baldridge family for several generations. What does Mr. Baldridge have to give up to be moved off this property? It wasn't until about Christmas time 1941 before any of the dispossessed property owners actually began to receive their payments from the federal government for their dispossessed property. Surrounding the Candia Baptist Church on its north and south sides was the church cemetery. It had actually been turned over to a private cemetery association by summer 1941. The Army War Department promised that this cemetery would continue to be a working private cemetery where burials could still take place on family plots and family descendants could visit almost any time. This is a February 2016 helicopter view of the Candia Cemetery. The open area in the center is where the church building stood. On Memorial Day in 2013, we local historians gathered at this Candia Cemetery and placed this wreath. In my brief remarks at this ceremony, I paid tribute to the Department of the Army for keeping its promise that this cemetery would continue to operate. The cemetery is open to the public on the Sunday of Memorial Day weekend each year. In the Varick portion of the Seneca Ordnance Depot, there was this church, the First Wesleyan Methodist Church of Varick. This church has some very special meaning to me in that my father's mother's father was a pastor there for many years, and it was the site of my grandmother's funeral just 3 years before the Army War Department took over this property. Now to talk briefly about the actual construction of the Seneca Ordnance Depot. Some of the bunkers are shown here. The decision to build this munitions supply base was made in early June 1941, about 6 months before the Pearl Harbor attack that brought the United States formally into World War II. The plan initially was to have this munitions supply base completed and operational in May 1942. But as it became more and more likely that the United States was going to enter the war, the timeline for completion of this Seneca Ordnance Depot was moved up to be no later than January 1st of 1942. Here you see a timeline for initial work on constructing this munitions supply facility. You will note the formal announcement of the selection of the site was made on June 11th, and that actual construction of the first munitions storage igloo was begun on August 21st, 1941. The reason for that delay is that there had to be a lot of initial construction work. Major infrastructure developments were needed, such as the construction of more roads, more railroad spurs, a more adequate water supply, more electrical service, bringing in telephone service. Before a new administration building could be built, a former fruit packing plant building was used as a temporary headquarters. The working conditions in these temporary administrative headquarters were less than ideal. Before desks could be obtained and delivered, makeshift work desks consisted of plank benches as desks and nail kegs as chairs. Given the lack of sufficient electrical service, initially, much of the office staff had to work some of their long hours making use of candles and kerosene lamps. This collage of pictures gives you some idea of the bedlam that characterized working conditions for these office workers. Without sufficient electricity, kerosene lamps were used by secretarial staff. In the top left picture, you see the female office staff simply eating their lunch in a worker's car. The Kendall Railroad Station had been closed prior to the choice of this site. So this Kendall Railroad Station had to be reopened quickly so that it could begin to be the receiving site for the heavy construction equipment that would be needed to help convert largely farms into sites for about 500 munitions supply igloos. Between August 21st and Thanksgiving 1941, approximately 500 concrete igloos were constructed, as well as the necessary supporting infrastructure. Here you see rows of the igloos. They're spaced far enough apart that if one managed to explode for whatever reason, it wouldn't cause an adjacent igloo to explode. This is the famous picture of the pouring of concrete for the first munition storage igloo. For each such igloo, a metal frame was used. This frame consisted of two semicircular frames, one inside the other, so that concrete could be poured in between these two frames. When the concrete hardened sufficiently, the metal frame could be removed and then used in pouring concrete for another igloo. When the War Department decided that construction of this munitions storage base needed to be completed by the end of 1941, it meant that the pouring of the concrete for these igloos needed to be completed before cold weather would set in around Thanksgiving time. So the pace of construction was speeded up. As a result, two world records for construction were set. To make this shortened time period for completion of this facility a reality, more and more construction workers were hired. In this chart, you see that on October 23rd, over 8,800 workers were employed in construction. The picture at right shows potential workers lined up at the employment office building, which previously had been the Kendall Grange Hall. Many workers were local, but as the need for workers increased, men from all over the state and even the eastern United States came to work here. Remember that this was still the later years of the Great Depression. Also remember that the federal government was paying good hourly wages, higher than what many local industries were. Here are some newspaper headlines showing the job opportunities for construction of this depot. In the bottom left picture, you see some of the men who came for jobs. In the bottom right, you see the interior of the former Grange Hall converted into the employment office. There is this wonderful true story of two young men who had just graduated from high school in Clyde. They came there with one of them seeking a job, and the other came to provide moral support for his good friend. When an employment officer asked that other young man why he wasn't filling out the paperwork for a job, that other young man said he was going to Syracuse University in September, and he just came there to support his friend. The employment officer said that to that other man, well, you could work here this summer and then you could go to Syracuse University. So that other young man also applied for a job, was hired on the spot, and started working. And he continued to work at the depot for the rest of his life. The pay was good and the job was secure. Several of the workers that came that summer of 1941 brought their families with them. The families lived in rather poor makeshift housing. At least they didn't have to worry much about cold weather during the summer. And the family was there with the male head of the household. Problems. In the Kendall hamlet, there was only one well for drinking water. The lower right picture shows an emptied out bus that was shared on alternate nights by 3 different families. The other 2 nights out of the 3, the family slept in their makeshift tent. The picture actually shows a local health inspector checking out the condition of the young girls. Well, there, I got it to move. Area people provided campgrounds, but the conditions at these campgrounds quickly became not very good. The local health inspectors closed some campgrounds until more healthy conditions were provided. Single young men working in construction work at the depot simply slept on mattresses at some places in nearby Geneva. Typically, they were trying to save as much of their pay as possible so that they could wire home to their parents as much of their earnings as possible. The federal government leased the county fairgrounds in Waterloo and brought in these trailers for families to live in while the man of the trailer was working on construction at the depot. These same trailers were used the next year in 1942 for workers involved in construction of Sampson Naval Station. This chart shows some construction facts. Significant. The nearby hamlets of Kendall and Romulus experienced a boom in business. Kendall went from being a hamlet of about 300 people to 6,000 that summer, 1941. As for Romulus, one newspaper reporter said the situation in Romulus was, quote, like moving New York's Times Square into the village of Romulus. The nearest city was Geneva. While it provided 1,000 of its residents as workers building the depot, there were 3,000 depot workers temporarily living in Geneva. When the United States formally entered World War II, the Seneca Ordnance Depot's role greatly expanded. While it continued to be a munitions supply base to defend the northeast coast of the United States against possible enemy attack, it went on to become a base to supply all kinds of supplies to wage the war in Europe. A shortage of male workers provided jobs for more than 600 female workers. They became known as WOWs, or Women Ordnance Workers. Many of them were truck operators, as shown in the bottom picture. In the latter years of World War II, over 250 Italian prisoners of war were doing some non-secure work at the Seneca Ordnance Depot. Area Italian families would come to the depot to spend their Sunday afternoons with these Italian POWs. Some area Italian families welcomed some Italian POWs into their homes, such as for Saturday night supper. We also know that some of the materials used in the Manhattan Project for the development of the first atomic bomb were temporarily stored at the Seneca Ordnance Depot. Many women played crucial work roles at the Seneca Ordnance Depot, being much more than just simply relegated to being secretaries. Shown here is one of many female employed as operators of fork trucks. This is an enlargement of that forklift truck operator that I showed previously. As incredible as it might sound today, during World War II, there was a real fear that enemy aircraft would bomb the munitions storage igloos of the Seneca Ordnance Depot. That these enemy aircraft would be able to fly about 200 miles inland without detection and succeed in their bombing mission. Area residents, especially females, took turns watching the skies by day or night for any indication of approaching enemy aircraft. This was true as far north as Lake Ontario and into all of the counties surrounding Seneca County. At the end of World War II, the original purpose for the Seneca Ordnance Depot came to an end. But as I have already indicated, the depot had a greatly expanded role during the war. After the war, the depot became a major supply storage facility. And here you see some examples of this role. One of the major types of work at the Seneca Army Depot in the years after both World War II and the Korean conflict was dealing with ammunition and missile storage and demolition. At lower left, I point out that no longer useful powder and ammunition was burned in a demolition pit. After closure of the Seneca Army Depot base in 2000, these demolition pits were hazmat zones where cleanup work had to continue for many years. The Seneca Army Depot continued as a major site for storage of supplies and equipment that might be needed for future use. The picture at top left shows the many warehouses on the eastern side of the depot. The equipment was in need of much regular maintenance. In the mid-1950s, the Department of the Army began the storage of what they called special weapons, in quotation marks, at the north end of the depot. That area became known as the Q area, and it had very tight security. For example, 3 fences surrounded the entire Q area, with the middle fence of very high voltage that could fry a human being. Along this fence were large nightlights and cameras. Although the Defense Department by policy would neither confirm nor deny that these special weapons were actually nuclear weapons, it seems pretty conclusive to me that they were tactical nuclear weapons. As the saying goes, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, talks like a duck, then I think you'll understand. This was a fake building in the Q area under which the fuses for the nuclear weapons were stored. This was part of the strategy of making it difficult for Soviet spy satellites to gain good information about the operations within this Q area. Another strategy was to build an extension on the opening of the storage igloos in the Q area, so that when the regular doors were opened up, the Soviet spy satellites could not see inside. The main administration building within the Q area was heavily fortified. The black arrows point out concrete areas where soldiers could defend against attackers, should those attackers somehow manage to penetrate the 3 fences surrounding the Q area. In the summer and fall of 1983, the Seneca Army Depot was the site of the first anti-nuclear weapons demonstration on any U.S. military facility. Special military police were brought in for security purposes. Much of the anti-war demonstrators were led by the Women's Encampment for a Future of Peace and Justice. There were some famous demonstrators, such as Dr. Benjamin Spock, shown bottom left. He, along with the other certain demonstrators, climbed over the depot fence and were arrested. There was also demonstrators against these anti-nuclear weapons demonstrators. This is a collage of images. At lower right, you see a picture of the white deer. They are not albino. They thrived within the security of the fences surrounding the Seneca Army Depot. At lower left, you see a badge that became an unofficial logo for the Seneca Army Depot. At top right, you see the very last tactical nuclear weapon as it's being moved out of the Seneca Army Depot. The withdrawal of the nuclear weapons from the Q area put the continued operation of the Seneca Army Depot in jeopardy. This withdrawal of the nuclear weapons from the Q area was coming at a time when the Defense Department operations were being scaled back because of the end of the Cold War. It led to this identity crisis for the continued operation of the Seneca Army Depot. The Defense Department was going to close the Seneca Army Depot rather abruptly, but local opposition led to the BRAC process having to be followed. 2 local organizations, COBRA, Keep Our Base in Romulus Alive, and SOS, Save Our Seneca, were active in forcing this change to use the BRAC process. By following the BRAC process, base realignment and closure process, the timeline for the formal base closure was extended so that the formal base closure did not come until July 2000. That extended time period meant that several civilian employees at the Seneca Army Depot had the opportunity to acquire the sufficient amount of time so as to retire or to gain employment at some other federal installation. Shown here is the second historic marker erected. This one denotes the existence of the Seneca Army Depot. This marker is located at the main entrance to the former depot. The marker was funded by the Seneca County Board of Supervisors. Except for some contaminated areas, most of the 10,000 acres of the former Seneca Army Depot were turned over by the Defense Department to Seneca County, which turned these lands over to the Seneca County Industrial Development Activity Agency. After several years of being unable to market the former depot, the lands were finally sold by the IDA to Earl Martin, a Mennonite who owns and operates Seneca Dairy Systems. He wanted to expand his company operations at the former depot. His associates wanted to establish several Amish family farms within acreage in the town of Romulus. Earl Martin wanted to use much of the Varick portion of the former Seneca Army Depot as Deer Haven Park, so as to ensure the continued well-being of the large herd of white deer and other fish and fowl and animals there. From November 2017 through December 2019, Seneca White Deer Incorporated provided public tours of Deer Haven Park. Earl Martin is continuing to provide seasonal public tours of Deer Haven Park. These tours resume this April. If you want to learn more about the history of the Seneca Army Depot up till 2012, I suggest you obtain a copy of this book. You will find the interviews of people who worked at the depot included in the book to be particularly interesting and informative. I'm hoping that there's some questions which I'll be glad to try to deal with, but of course you can contact me directly at one of these contacts means for further questions and information. I also want to add that a new display of tracing the history of the Seneca Army Depot has just been erected on the top floor of the Seneca County Office Building in Waterloo. Most of the display posters have been loaned by Seneca White Deer Incorporated. I thank you for your patience, and now I'll try to deal with questions.
Hi, Walter. This is Harrison. It looks like we've got a few questions in the chat box. Again, to anyone who didn't get the message, please leave any comments or questions you might have in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be glad to pass those along to Walter. It looks like the first question we have is, what were the Cayuga people who were dispossessed of their land? This looks like it says, sort of how were they compensated or paid after the Revolutionary War?
There were a series of treaties, 1795, 1805, I believe it is, 1806. I don't have those dates necessarily correct, but if they're approximate, a series of treaties that, and one prior to 1795, by which the state of New York in these treaties managed to have the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee peoples, primarily Senecas, but also Cayugas, especially Cayugas for later on, something we're going to say, give up most of their lands, although there were some reservation lands, and then they even gave those up, and they were given some payment for that. But that happened almost 150 years before the federal government takes over these lands in 1941 to make the depot.
Thank you. It looks like we have a comment from Anne Marie Fitzgerald. She says that her family name is Cocott, and multiple descendants of her family have a strong connection to what you said, and they greatly appreciate your presentation.
Absolutely. I grew up as the youngest of 5 boys. My parents had a farm on 414 south of Fayette, and we had neighbors to the north, to the south, to the east that were all farmers that were dispossessed of their properties in 1941. So, you know, it was a hardship. One of those neighbors, even into the early 1980s, you had only to mention the depot, and his whole facial demeanor and tone of voice changed to that, just so bitter about how they were forced off their land and the crops were not harvested and so on.
Absolutely. It looks like we have a couple other attendees who have family connections, so I think that is very great. Again, if anyone else has any questions, leave those in the chat box. It looks like we just got another one in, Walter. It says, my family lived in Kendall from the 1960s to the 1980s, and it was a ghost town. What is the status of the Kendall now? Still a whole lot of nothing?
You could probably have some people characterize it as still quite a bit of a ghost town. There are people that are still living there. Some of the buildings look rather poorly maintained. What was that Grange Hall that became the temporary employment center is now, I think it's called Something and Treasures, selling different kinds of items in season, especially on the weekends. You know, it's not a thriving hamlet of 6,000, that's for sure.
Absolutely. It looks like those are all the questions. We're getting in a lot of, thank you very much. And the library thanks you as well. It looks like we're getting a live question from Dolores Fitzgerald. If you could leave that in the chat box, I would be happy to share that with Walter.
I just wanted to say that I grew up in Romulus and was born on one of those farms that was dispossessed. I don't live there anymore. I still have the farm. But at any rate, I recall the depot. I recall the number of workers. My family had boarders. We fed people. And it truly, as Walter says in Romulus, it was a boom town, no question.
The Romulus post office was very, very busy handling mail, especially for the depot workers, mailing home as much of their paychecks as they could so that the families, you know, their families that were suffering from the Depression could have money. I went through the Romulus school system, and so, you know, very, very vivid memories of lots of things about the depot.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to say, somebody, can you hear me? Somebody had asked about where people had stayed and where the worker has stayed. I believe I read that in the former Ovid High School, which is now torn down, that had been converted to housing as well. Is that accurate, Walter?
Yes, I believe that is certainly correct. And all kinds of families in the South Seneca area opened up their homes. They were encouraged by the federal government to rent out rooms to for depot construction workers to live. there.
Right. I think I had read, perhaps it was in your book, that when people were coming from all over the country or from the South in particular, housing became a problem and sanitation became a problem. So they, after a while, were advised, unless you had a place to stay, don't plan to come here. Is that accurate?
I don't know if it got quite to that extreme, but of course the health authorities came in and they mandated inspections to maintain certain things. And as I also pointed out in the program, the federal government finally brought in trailers at the fairgrounds in Waterloo for families to live in while the man of the house was doing construction work. Probably today there would be tighter procedures along that line from the very beginning than what was true in 1941. But things were just happening so fast, especially with the moving up of the timeline for completion, that things can just easily get out of hand quickly.
Right. And I just wanted to, one last comment from as far as the Women's Peace Encampment, that recently I digitized the 1983 Obit Gazette, specifically writing a grant about the Women's Peace Encampment, and these were not available on microfilm before, and so I felt like these original papers are really important to the local history, and they are available on the Edith B. Ford Memorial Library website. If you scroll down to the drop-down menu of history, you can view the 1983, 84, and 1995 Obit Gazettes. And that was the focus of the closing of Willard Psychiatric Center. So.
Thanks for sharing that.
It looks like we have one more question. It's asking, exactly where was Kendall in relation to Romulus, New York?
Well, Kendall, we probably need to say, is quite an extensive area in the town of Romulus, east of Seneca Lake. Sampson State Park is a part of what we generally call Kendall. Then it's more than a mile south of the entrance to Sampson State Park that we have the Sampson Veterans Memorial Cemetery, and that's basically still Kendall. The Indian village that was Kendall, or Appletown, was located basically between those two places. So it's that area of western town of Romulus on the east shore area of Seneca Lake.
Okay, Walter, thank you. It looks like we have another question asking if you have participated or contributed any presentations regarding Sampson State Park or just Sampson in general.
Yes, I've done programs on Sampson State Park, on the whole history of Sampson, separately on Sampson Naval Station, separately on Sampson Air Force Base, and so on. So I can do that. And I do welcome invitations to do programs for school classes, for community groups and organizations within Seneca County and even outside of Seneca County.
All right, I guess we'll take any final questions down in the chat box, and we'll hold that open for another minute or so in case anyone has any final thoughts.
Guess not. Kindergarten.
again, that's just the chat button right at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, we'll keep that open for just another moment or so. Okay, Walter, it looks like we got one more question. Where was the bridge that crossed Cayuga Lake located?
The Cugalong Bridge would be, if you are familiar with the hamlet or village of Cayuga on the east shore of Seneca Lake, or if, excuse me, Cayuga Lake, or if you're familiar with Baird Street, East Baird Street extension in Seneca Falls, that the bridge went connecting those two places. It was part of the Great Genesee Road from basically Utica, and then eventually goes all the way to Buffalo. And so that's where the bridge was. But there were actually, the first bridge was started in 1800. It was not constructed very, very well for the ices that happen in that area. And it was out of operation by 1807. And so there was, while a new bridge was being built basically in the same place, a temporary bridge was built about a mile north, and it became known as the Outlet Bridge. And that bridge continued in operation until into the 1840s. And so then there was the new Cugalong Bridge built, and then it was replaced by still another. By 1857, that bridge was no longer in operation. In 1928 and 1930, the New York State Legislature passed bills that provided for building a modern highway, basically on the location of this Cugalong Bridge. Both times the bill was vetoed by then Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt. And it may have been because there was a concern about expending too much money to build such a project, but I think there's more to the story than that. But so that site was at the very much more near the northern end of the Cayuga Lake. Actually north of where present-day Cayuga Lake State Park is.
Absolutely. I think that is all of our questions that we have for you, Walter. On behalf of the library, we thank you for this presentation, and I am also getting quite a lot of thank yous from our audience. So thanks again, and this concludes our presentation.
And thank you all who joined in.